Ladies and gentlemen, I warmly welcome you back to the Masterclass Monday webinar series by Embedded Wizard. Embedded Wizard is the GUI solution by Terra Systems, and we are, as I just said, in our fourth edition today of the Masterclass Mondays, and today's topic will be the Mosaic framework. My name is Kristin. I'm responsible for marketing and communications here at Terra Systems, and can say that we will be covering today some interesting topics in the Mosaic framework. Among others, you will learn how event handlers work and what is all about the screen management. And this is also the point where already my colleague Manuel comes into play. He's our product manager here at Embedded Wizard. And as he was doing in the first three episodes, he will be guiding you through the Mosaic framework. So let's getting started.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christine, for the pleasant introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our attendees worldwide. Today's topic is, as Christine already said, the Mosaic framework. So the base and the fundamental of every GUI project which has been implemented with Embedded Wizard. What are the topics for today's masterclass? In fact, I'll show you the basic views and the basic effects, which are the very primitives that are available inside Embedded Wizard. I'll give you a brief overview about the different event handlers. I also show you how to use the widgets and the templates. Then I'll give you some brief overview about the so-called scrollable content. So that means lists and outline containers, for example. And finally, something which has been asked meanwhile quite a couple of times is how to deal with different screens inside Embedded Wizard. So the so-called dialog framework is used, and I give you a brief overview how to do that. Yeah, and to do that, let's get started and start Embedded Wizard Studio in version 9.30. So creating a new project, and we say Masterclass episode 4. By the way, as you have seen, the topics to be covered are quite immense, so if we will not cover everything within 60 minutes, so please do not blame me, and I try to keep the pace, and let's go ahead. Perhaps you remember last time when we spoke about the programming language Cora, that when you need to visualize something, some runtime environment, so you want to start the prototyper, you need some class which is derived from core group, and that way I'm just jumping directly into the new created application environment, which gives me a very small test bed to let customers get started. So where do you now find the Mosaic class? First of all, on the left side in the gallery, there you find dedicated items. So let's, for example, start with the basic one, which are the views. And as you can imagine, and as you probably already might know, drag and drop different kind of elements and changing that directly inside the view, inside the composer, gives you already a first feedback. So the drag and drop the element of this one, so the filled rectangle, this is now already implemented with Cora. Selecting that, then you can change the different settings inside the inspector. So that means, for example, changing the color from white to black. And there are other properties, but these are not so important right now. But what I want to show you is when you now double click on that, then you see now the implementation of this fuse rectangle. And in fact, you already see that this rectangle belongs to the unit fuse. So going now into the unit by clicking that button there, this now opens the implementation of all different kind of views that are available inside the Mosaic framework. And as you see, everything is now implemented in Cora, so that means you can also make your own derivations out of the standard implementation if there is something that does not fulfill your requirement. Could be just make a copy or just derive from it and change that. However, something which is not possible, for example, I'm now here in the rectangle, I want to remove that to rectangle 2 and save that, and then Embedded Wizard already says it seems that you have modified the Mosaic framework inside the unit view. The Mosaic units, however, belong to the core functionality of Embedded Wizard and are protected against any modification. Hence, the unit views has not been saved. So it could be that during your development you already see this kind of error and proper warning. Then please note that you are not allowed to do any modifications. Why? Because this is the core, this is the base functionality of every UI project. So this is used among all GUI projects throughout all our customers, and we need to support somehow this functionality, of course. And if you would do any modifications, then we cannot ensure that it works as expected. So our support will not be as good as we assume that, or as we usually assume that your Mosaic framework has not been changed. And so please do modifications not within the framework itself. However, if you want to do any modifications and adaptation, just make a copy, just derive from this different derive from the dedicated element that you want to override, for example. So just removing that, so that means pressing now Ctrl Z, or just doing this undo here and saving, and back again, so all the references are there, and in fact now everything is as expected. So this one goes for the how it is structured. When you go to the project itself, then you already see that there's dedicated elements are there which are captured as Mosaic framework. So the caption there is already stated that these units belong to the Mosaic framework. So we have the views where we're already there, so like the rectangle that we just used. We have other things like different effects, where the integer 32 effect is, for example, there, or the color effect. This is something that I'm using very often. All the transitions are there, which are used or can be used when it comes to the screen management aspect that we will cover later on. We have the graphics, which are more some very core and core elements, which are the base now for other views inside the Mosaic framework. For example, the canvas, where you can draw directly a pixel to the dedicated element. And dealing with resources, there are a couple of default resources, otherwise you would not see for example an image when you just drag and drop this simple bitmap view into your composer, for example. And these are the basic elements that are required in order to make the basic views visible. And finally we have the core view, and as the name implies, these are the core aspects. For example, there's the core group, remember we had last time, which is essential when it comes to make things visible at the end. We have different kind of events. We have for the scrollable content, the outline, the lists. We have different kind of handlers. For the touch handler, we have the key handlers, timer are there, and some sophisticated things like task management, which can be used in order to create sequentially tasks that needs to be processed inside the application. For example, you have an animation, and that animation should stop, and then the next animation should be started, etc. So you have a queue of dedicated elements that needs to be processed depending on the timing, etc. And then these task managements, for example, is a very nice element that can help you to create these sequentially runnable tasks. Please do not mix this up with tasks in terms of an RTOS, an real-time operating system, or a thread. So this is something which is not meant with this one. It's just to create different subsequent jobs that are stacked together, something like that. These are now the basic ones. So just going back to the project, going to the application, my main route, we have this black rectangle. So when selecting this black rectangle, what items can be changed and what properties and what attributes? What I did before is the color attribute. Something which is already there is, for example, different color for each corner of that rectangle. Now what happens when I'm now setting this color for the bottom left, and let's go to the blue, then you see that there is some gradient put on top. However, as you see, inside the attributes I've selected the black color and only set the bottom left color to achieve that this gradient. When I now switch the view and go back to the application, then you see where's now my gradient, where is now this blue color on this bottom left corner, even if it is configured. In fact, there's the default color, and this has a higher priority to be rendered. So that means if you would like to create a gradient, please ensure that the color property of that view is not set. In that way, I just need to restore to the default value by pressing Ctrl R on my keyboard or by selecting this application. And when I'm now just reloading, then you see that there's now the blue color on the bottom left corner, and changing now the view and starting again, this now ensures that this gradient is drawn as expected. Of course, if you would now would like to have some black one, then you would need to define all other aspects of this color statement, not statement of this color property here. Something that I get also asked very often is a question: does Embedded Wizard support alpha blending? And we're just seeing here now this property. Of course, Embedded Wizard does support alpha blending, which is independent from the chosen frame buffer format. So if you have a frame buffer format of RGB 565, for example, then there's no dedicated alpha channel. But inside Embedded Wizard, we are of course doing some alpha blending. So please do not get worried. Depending on the frame buffer color to be used, alpha blending is built inside throughout the entire system. So how to do alpha blending, or how to achieve that? In fact, we have now selected this color gradient with the blue one and with a full opaque value, so that means that the alpha value goes to 255. When I do some smaller value for this alpha channel here, then you see that this bottom left corner gets transparent. For example, let's just put an image now into this view and restack that one layer down, so that it lies now beyond this current image. You see that also this rectangle. Sorry, you see that also inside this Z ordering, where the image has now a lower order number compared to the rectangle. And what I'm now doing is I have changed the alpha value of the color, so it now goes to 80. When you just do a full color, so full opaque 255, then you do not see the image anymore. And this is now something where you see, okay, the alpha blending is working as expected. However, it could be, depending on the hardware that they're using, that alpha blending is not supported with different kind of applications. So this is really dependent on the hardware, and then you can enforce, for example, that this kind of alpha blending is not going to be done with a blend operation. So that means by setting that to false, says, okay, now this image is copied into the frame buffer. So this is something which might have an benefit, because usually copying an image from one source to one destination with a dedicated bit splitting engine is often supported rather than blending from a source over to a destination. And this is something where you can also fine-tune and optimize a little bit the different operations depending on if a blend operation is required or not. So just going back to true, so it means it is alpha blended, and you instantly see this kind of image. However, something where this is also essential to be used in order to make a so-called hole, or to punch a hole into the GUI. Just think about, you would have an external video decoder sitting somewhere in this area. So let's just remove now this color and say, okay, this is the full color and not blue one, just restore default. So just a simple white rectangle there. And now on that position you would like to have a video. The video is decoded with an external engine, depending on the system. There are different kind of ways. However, just think about that inside the frame buffer layer where Embedded Wizard draws the rectangle, that below from the hardware perspective is a video layer. And now you need to punch a hole into the UI. How can this be achieved? And in fact, this is very easy now due to that alpha blended value. Now, for example, you have now the UI. I've just picked out this wallpaper here, and you want that this inside, or where this white rectangle, just restack that up, should now be punched a hole inside. So in fact, you simply define that it is totally alpha blended, so it's now empty, but it should not be blended, it should be copied to the system. So that means by changing now this value from true to false, that now an empty or with a fully transparent rectangle is now copied into the UI, and that would now ensure that on the hardware system the underlying video bitmap frame, or the frames of the video, are now made visible through that whole exception on that screen, for example. So next to the rectangle we have, of course, the line views, which can also be for example, make it a little bigger. So just now say width 2 to 7, for example, then you would have some line view, for instance, with different points. Where should this now be, and where should now this be drawn? Another thing that is worth to be mentioned is the property visible, and this now belongs to all others as well. Visible means that if this should now be made visible during runtime or not. During runtime, for example, this line should not be made visible, it should be hidden, then you simply say false. However, it is not taken into account inside the composer, otherwise you would not see it, so you could not select that. By pressing now the prototyper, then you would see that this one, so this line that we have just configured, is not going to be shown due to that element and the property visible equals false. When we set it to true again and restart again the prototyper, then you see that this line segment is going to be made visible, for example. So this is for the line element. We have other views like the border element, which gives you a border at the end. I just make this width a little bit more bigger, so 5 pixels, for example. Then we have already there the image, where you can pick other image resources. So for example, some default frame image resource, or so we have added other bitmaps as well that can be used out of the box, for example, inside your project. However, to add new bitmaps, I just like to refer to one of our previous masterclasses where I showed you how to use the studio. And adding the bitmap is very simple, just to drag and drop that into a dedicated unit and use that as a reference for this kind of image view, for example. Then we have the bitmap frame. This is something which is also very nice to use. These are so-called 9 sliced bitmaps. So in fact, this bitmap that you are seeing here now inside image, this is the source. However, when it is used inside this bitmap frame, then the bitmap frame uses that source bitmap and divides that into 9 parts. We have a part that belongs to the top left corner. We have a part belongs to the top right corner, to the bottom right corner, to the bottom left corner, everything in between. And when you now change now the size of that image view of that bitmap frame, for example, then the corners are just copied and put into the resulting bitmap frame, and all other aspects are then just multiplied and filled and used to fill the entire bitmap frame, which gives you some kind of scalable images. Usually those kind of bitmap frames are used when it comes to buttons. You have a button and you have different kind of buttons, a small button, a big button. However, the look and feel should always be the same. So that means with the rounded corners here in that example, and with that you can very easily define scalable images, for example. Another bitmap view, so this is one, a very simple one, the bitmap frame, is finally this wallpaper that I've already used and dragged and dropped before. The wallpaper, as the name implies, is just using one image and copying it from throughout the entire view. And you can also use other things, like for example define now here the opacity, which is the entire alpha value. So let's for example take 80, and you see that then that now this wallpaper image view is made transparent to the underlying image views or groups according to the Z ordering. Now when it comes to draw not only images, then usually you would like to draw text elements. Text elements means that we have two kind of different text elements. Drag and dropping them into the canvas, making these a little more bigger, will render now this very simple text view. However, in order to make things more visible, just assigning a new font, and we already had one of our previous masterclasses how to add font resources or other font resources. These can be used from your installed fonts, for example, inside the Windows System folder, or when you would copy a TrueType font, for example, inside the project folder of Embedded Wizard, then this this additional font is then loaded during the start of Embedded Wizard Studio and can be used now for example in your project. And this would be something that I would recommend. So really put your text TrueType font elements or text element in TrueType font, the fonts inside the project folder, and save them according to your project structure, so that you can also easily share the proper font among other colleagues which are active in your project, or when you want now to maintain the GUI development later on, so 6 months later, it could be that there is a new font already installed inside your Windows system, and now font shapes could be that they are now rendered differently compared to the previous version. And with storing the TrueType font inside the project, then you can ensure that always the same font is used inside the project. And of course, you can store that within your JIT repository or SVN repository or whatsoever. And this is something that I would recommend. So what I'm now doing is just using the default fonts. I do not add any new fonts, and simply changing now the color so that you can see that to a more darker color, in fact. And there are a couple of other things that are essential when it comes to drawing this text view. Ellipses. This is something when you have a very big font, not font, a big string, sorry. For example, we have text, and we're just doing stuff, without these. So having just some bigger text strings there, and with the ellipses you would just say okay at the end, just make and beginning just put some dots in that in order to indicate that this text string is too long in order to be shown inside that text view. Just one easy way. Enable BD text. This is something if you would like to run during runtime, so dynamically, Arabic string or Hebrew string, then this is something that you would need to tell Embedded Wizard that you would have some bidirectional text. So that means when it comes from right to left rendering that and you need to display now an Arabic value, so a number, then the right to left is changed from left to right in order to display the Arabic number properly, and after the number has been rendered, then it switches back to right to left and starts again from the left position of the currently or the just rendered number. And this is something that needs to be enabled or disabled so that Embedded Wizard knows what to use depending on the proper settings for the dedicated string. Then we have, for example, some other things, which is the so-called alignment. When you can say, okay, it's aligned horizontal, or you would just like to align it horizontal on the left side, and you see that it's aligned to the left, and the same also applies to the vertical alignment and not in the center. It could also be aligned to the top, for example, and then you see that the top left corner is then used as the anchor point for rendering that string. Another thing which is important when it comes to rendering string, you would also need to tell the text view that if it is a multi, if it is bigger, that the text itself should be wrapped. So in that case, Embedded Wizard takes then care in order to wrap the text accordingly, and you can fine-tune that depending on the proper dependencies. We had already the visible, so that's clear. Scroll offset, this is something where you can now define a dedicated scroll offset. For example, if you would then overlay this text view with a slide handler, for example, then it's very easy to define where now this slide handler should be applied to that currently rendered string. The orientation, also a very nice feature if you would like to rotate the text more in a 90 degrees perspective. For example, if you would have some text from here put on the left side and rotate it accordingly, this is something that you could add accordingly, depending on your UI requirements. Next to this very simple text, we also have the so-called attributed text. So just make this a little bit more bigger. So what is now the attributed text? In fact, the attribute text is a very, very, very simple formattable text view that can be used to make different elements of the text appear different, so different color or bold. You could also add images inside the currently running text, and this is often used when it comes to display help text. Just think about your device and you need to display the user sitting in front of your device that there is a heart button, and this heart button has a dedicated symbol, for example a left arrow, for example, or on right arrow, just a cursor keys. And if you would now have some help text and say, okay, press the left corner to blah blah blah, go to the menu, press left arrow to go to the menu, press the right arrow to go to a sub menu, for example, then you could use this attributed text in order to make one whole text, but using images now inside this render text, for example. In fact, embedded wizard needs to know how to render this attributed text, and therefore you need to define a so-called attributed set. Per default, we are using the default attributed set, and of course, you could also use some your own attributed set, and you can find those inside the resources folder and drag and drop that into your into your screen here, into the canvas, and you can now define how different bitmaps are used. You can define how different colors are used. You can define how different fonts or which font should be used, and assign that according to your text view. Now, how to define where now these different kind of images are used, for example, or this different kind of elements are used. And this, in fact, by selecting now this attributed text, you see that the string now comes with some markup. For example, text image 0, and this in curly braces, which now indicates to Embedded Wizard that now, according to the proper attributed set, this image 0 should be used and displayed accordingly. And of course, you can use your own attributed set and create your own attributed text according to your GUI requirements. At that point, I really like to encourage you to have a look at our knowledge base, which gives you very much information how this different kind of markups, for example, are used. Gives you proper examples how different colors are used and fonts are used, and gives you much more detail on how to use this kind of technique in order to create some kind of attributed text at the end. So going back to the views, we have now had the rectangles and lines and the image stuff. We had now had the text elements. Something which is also very easy is a core group, and what you see inside the core group, it's empty. Core group is, as previously mentioned, the base for your own widget, for your own UI control. This could now be a very simple UI control, for example, a button, or can also be an entire screen if you have to deal with different screens inside the GUI application. So this is just a very simple group. We have now the warp images and warp groups. So what is this warp image? Just drag and drop those, and then you see nothing, because you would now sorry, I have picked the warp group, warp image. And now you see now the same image which has been used now inside this attribute text of before, with a very simple image view. And this warp image is the possibility, or you have the possibility to make a perspective transformation of a dedicated image. Perspective transformation means when I now drag and drop this left bottom corner here, that it gets now scaled to this kind of view, for example, to make this more a 3D look. 3D Embedded Wizard does not support proper 3D views. So for example, if you would put the GUI on a round sphere, for example, and do some rotation that, or use an element that should be shuffled, should be moved in its position from different angles, that you probably know what I mean, then this is something which requires a 3D functionality, and this is something that Embedded Wizard does not support. However, with this 2.5D elements, so like the warp groups and warp images, then you can do a perspective transformation. Scaling, rotating is possible, and with that we say you can achieve 2.5D GUIs. And something which is important, we offer this kind of functionality throughout all systems. So that means on the very low-end microcontroller, Cortex M4 based system, up to an MPU with OpenGL and multi-cores, etc. This is something which runs on all different kind of applications. Of course, when there's no hardware acceleration that can be used in order to make this kind of perspective transformation, then we are falling back to software routines. And when the screen is when the CPU is not that powerful, then it's something that you could have a bad impact on the overall frame rate when you're doing some overlaying of this warping, or if you want to rotate that, etc. So please keep that in mind. If you do not have a hardware which has a proper 3D core, please use those warp groups, warp images for your perspective transformation. With a proper knowledge in mind how to use that, so that it will not take too much CPU power in order to have some more power at the end to render the entire GUI. So this is for the image. So you simply assign dedicated image to that warp image there, and you can simply render that. The question is, why are there different colors? This just belongs to different bitmap formats. For example, if you have a so-called alpha 8 bitmap image, so that means an image which only takes care about the alpha value of different pixel inside that image, then you can assign a color to such an alpha 8 bitmap, and that gets then colorized depending on your settings that you're doing with these color properties. So there's some lighting effect, for example, that can be done different points. So that means, where are they stored inside the canvas, for example. Another aspect which is important to know is the quality parameter when it comes to the warp group and warp image views. The quality says if a proper bilinear filter should be used in order to make very smooth edges, for example. When you have, let's take a very extreme example. So then you see that this one is very smooth. You have nice edges, and when you change now the quality parameter to false, then you see already here it's and especially here in that way that you have this kind of ugly effects. Of course, it's much faster when this bilinear filter is disabled on the hardware, and this especially comes into place when you would need to fall back to software routines. For example, if you have that requirement to make this kind of perspective transformation, just try it out on the hardware, and if you think, okay, it's now my system goes down, then simply try to set the quality to false. Of course, this is something that have to be discussed with your designer, if he's happy now with this kind of functionality, or if it is required to have these smooth edges, for example. This is another very important parameter when it comes to the warp group images. Source anchor, source area, these are the parameters to define where is this image now based inside the entire screen, for example, when it comes to inside the canvas. And this is essential when it comes to the rotation, where should now this needle be put into the image before making the rotation, just to have the proper source anchor and the source area for rotation zooming. This is essential there. This is for the warp image. The warp group, this is something where the proper group needs to be assigned, and in fact we don't have any group yet. Why is that? Because you need an object that can be put now into this group. So let's make just a very simple object and a group, and therefore just remember we can pick a class, and the class should be now my 3D, not 3D, 2.5D view, something like that, and it should be derived, remember from the last session, from a core group. Double click on that, opens the implementation. Now make this a little more bigger, and let's say, okay, we have here a text view and something like that, and the text view should have a dark color, and we're using now another font, something like that. So we have now a very own component, UI control, depending on my design with a embedded text element. Of course, we could also now use some, let's make some rectangle there. Oh, not a rectangle, always a rectangle. Let's make some bevel there to have this kind of view, for example. And this is now my object. So going back now to my application, I can now not use, for example, when I have now selected this warp group, I cannot use my new defined view. It does not appear inside this assistant window here. Why? Because we only had, just remember last time, we only had defined a class. In order to make an object, also remember the last time, you could also make, so just copy a so-called auto object. And this is something that we are now using. So this is my 2.5D view class. Let's put it that way. And this is the instance, so the auto object of my class. Sorry, going back. Just renaming that without the one. So this is now an object. The object is then initiated every time I'm using it. So my singleton. So no worries. It will only be used when we are going to use it. So now we have that core group defined. We have now an object, and it now appears. However, what you now see is that it's still an empty core group. Why? Because Embedded Wizard needs to know, okay, when should this be made visible? And there's some trick to keep in mind, that this auto object, or this object of that class, needs to be buffered. So that means that it is pre-rendered into an intermediate canvas, and now that canvas can be used with the proper 3D object, so with the warp group. And with that, you can now do the perspective transformation of this newly created class, this 2.5D view, for example. So assigning a group, so that means you need to have an instance. Could also be that you have now this instance initiated of the dedicated class inside that group, or use an auto object and take care that it is set to buffered. This is something that is important to know. So this is now for the warp images, for the warp group. Now there's some additional basic stuff, which is the so-called vector graphics, but this is very brief, because our idea is to spend a whole masterclass series about the vector graphics support. I just want to show you those elements. We have two different elements. One is a filled path, so that means you have a filled area at the end, and the other one is a stroked path, so where the path is defining a stroke path at the end, and this is not something to be used. Just remember the attributed text, or the warp group. You always need, now in this case the same, to define where are the resources to be used for this vector graphic views. And by selecting that, you would then see that we have defined a default path, and having that the same object used, like the attributed set, for example, it will be the same to use this path data there and assign that path data, for example, now to my filled path in that way. So you see, it's not only default path that is available, you could also use default path, but as this path is not filled with any data, so there are no subpaths, there's no SVG string given, etc. This filled path is set empty because there's no data inside. You would need to fill that, but as said, don't be afraid that we will cover this in a separate masterclass at the end. So going back there, finally we have this vertical list, horizontal list, and outline box. These are the so-called some helper stuff to make scrollable content, but this is something I'd like to mention later on. Now let's have a look at other very basic elements of the Mosaic framework, which are the so-called effects. And the thing that I'd like to mention is the timer and the other effects here. A timer, by drag and dropping that, making an object of a timer object, and you could now simply define how this timer object should be used. For example, first of all, it should be enabled. It should trigger every 1000 milliseconds or every second. It should begin immediately. You could also define some offset when this timer should be enabled. And finally, you should tell Embedded Wizard, or especially the timer, which function should be triggered. And remember, the last time we had these very famous slot method, and this is now something that I'm using here as well. So just renaming that, this is my timer slot, and that timer slot is now assigned with the onTrigger parameter inside this timer object there. And what's now happening when I now would start the prototyper, I can also say now here trace called by timer, for example, and when I now press the play button and going to the debug window, then you see that every second this proper message is posted. So with that, it's very primitive, a timer just to have a proper time base. You can change that timer already during runtime. For example, the first time that I'm started, then I said, okay, timer stop timer. So that means this is a signal, a slot method which needs to be signaled. So signal timer, stop timer, and then this timer shuts down. So just closing that. And you see that it's only now called once. We clear the lock, pressing again the play button. Then it comes only once. Timer is then stopped, and that's it. So 1 second has been gone, and you see now the timer has been stopped. So this is a very primitive. Based on the timer functionality, we have different kind of effects made available. A very easy one, for example, is the Boolean effect. Now the Boolean effect can be also configured. For example, it needs to be enabled. For example, cycle duration should be 1 second, so 1000 milliseconds, so called every second. You could have an initial delay, initial cycle delay. You could also tell, okay, only 10 times this Boolean effect should come into place, or 0 an endless timer is there, and at the end you can define different values, so from false to true and back again. So just swiping that, and at the end you could define a dedicated outlet. This is now done with the observer pattern. Just think about the last time, and this could now, for example, be my warp group that we have, the visible, and with that, when I'm now just pressing play, then you see that this text warp group is now made visible and made invisible in with every second, just alternating all the time. So very, very easy to use. And based on this effect, we have different other effects depending on the data type. So this is now for a Boolean. We have for floats, integer. Remember last time we have dedicated data types inside Cora, and these can also be used with dedicated effects. So for example, to pulse a color, to move a point, or to move and resize a rectangle, for example. Very, very easy one. The other effects that you see here, these will be mentioned later on when we talk about the dialog framework and how to go ahead with different screens and how to make transitions from one screen to another. So this is for the effects. Now let's have a look at the different kind of user input methods that can be used. Therefore, I'm just opening this so-called event handlers tab inside the gallery. In fact, you see two different kind of event handlers, so-called event handlers. The first one is a so-called key press handler. Drag and drop that element, of course, will not give you any visual result, because then it's just an object. And that key handler, in fact, it can be configured according to your needs. So for example, if you want to listen on the yeah, let's pick for example the cursor keys, on any of the cursor keys, then this key handler should be taking that input into account, and as you see, on hold, on press, and on release, depending on which kind of element is being received into the system, depending on that, yeah, different kind of slots can be assigned. I already have that timer slot, so let's rename that not timer slot and say, okay, this is just my general purpose. My general purpose slot. So, for example, just say, okay, is this slot again? And now the key handler just say, okay, on press, let's trigger the on so-called slot method there. So just what it says, slot is not there, so I think this one. And hold on, because it was already slots, so let's say this is my key press handler, and inside my key handler I've got there the key press handler. Okay, so let's, for example, put that there, and we said, okay, not called by timer, we said called by key press handler, and this one is not required anymore, and of course we can just, to be sure, remove the timer there. So let's start now the prototyper, and as you know, we defined now any cursor key for that key handler, and we're now pressing that on my keyboard. Then you see now here inside this debug window, it comes up with the trace method, and every time I'm now pressing my cursor keys on my keyboard, dedicated trace methods gets invoked and prints it out to the log window. If you're not sure how different keys are now mapped inside your in your PC environment, so for example, you also have these other keys like blue or channel up, channel down key, for example. Just think about remote control over TV set. Then that's also very easy. By starting the prototyper, just press and hold down the control key on your keyboard, what I'm now actually doing, and then you get a proper overlay how different keys are mapped now to dedicated other values there. The values at the end, so for example cursor keys, or what I just said, blue key for example, these one are simple enumerations defined inside Mosaic, and those can be used outside Embedded Wizard inside the main loop on the embedded system in order to feed the proper value into the key handler every time when, for example, via GPIO dedicated element is button is pressed, that you get then the mapping from your GPIO to, for example, this key code blue in that case, and this is done outside Embedded Wizard. Yeah, and in order to see how this one behaves, just drag and drop this element there inside the canvas, configure it. Of course, you can define multiple key handlers. So this one says key handler for blue, whereas the others say key handler, I don't know, for channel up, something like that. And then you would define channel up and assign it to dedicated different slot methods, for example. And so you can build up your GUI according to React and accordingly and react on proper key events. Usually when you have a display I would say most of the cases you also have some kind of touch display, so with a dedicated touch controller, and Embedded Wizard itself already has built-in functionalities to detect different kind of touch gestures. The very easiest one is the simple touch handler, so that means drag and dropping that into the canvas would now add this simple touch handler, which can also be configured according to your needs. And you see it's also a polygon, which can be shaped according to your needs. If you only have dedicated subsections on your screen, for example, that should react on different touch handlers and should react differently, not one size fits all, for example, then this can be shaped very, very easily. And in the same manner as a key press handler was, you just select that and you say, okay, which slot method should be signaled depending on different kind of events, dragged, hold, leave, pressed, released, entered, etc. And with that you can very easily define which action should be done and should be processed depending on your input. Some other things, more for the configuration aspects is, for example, the max strike count property or the minimum strike count property, which says, okay, if you have multiple fingers there on and press it multiple times, if this touch handler should then react or not. So just play with that or use that according to your needs. So for example, we are now using this on press, and we have here our key press handler, and going there and say, okay, for this one, it's not a key press handler now it is a touch handler, just renaming that and called by touch handler. Would then clear the lock, give me the proper parameters every time I'm now pressing inside the dedicated area where my touch screen, my simple touch handler is located. Next to the simple touch handler, we have also some other touch handlers. For example, this wipe touch handler, which would recognize the so-called wipe touch gestures, whereas the rotate touch handler would detect different rotate gestures. And finally, we have the so-called slide touch handler, which is then used, for example, for sliding, for scrolling list items, for example. This one is something that we will use very, very soon. So these are the four basics ones. So it's not required outside Embedded Wizard, inside the main loop, for example, to detect if this is now a slide touch handler, a slide event, or some simple event, or some rotate event. This is entirely done inside Embedded Wizard, which can be used for your project very, very easily. I do not want to go in too much detail for all the different kind of parameters. They are all well documented on within our reference manual on inside the knowledge base of Embedded Wizard. And so please have a look there, because otherwise we would spend multiple hours just only going through every aspect. However, just something which is important to know is where was it? Sorry, it is so limit to finger, which is already something that indicates that all the gestures are already enabled to support multi-touch gestures, for example. And Embedded Wizard is multi-touch capable, so you can use touch gestures very in a parallel way, for example, for the classical pinch zooming, or just do some touching simultaneously with two fingers on two items. This is something that would work already, or this will already works with Embedded Wizard. So with these basic elements, like the views for rectangles, lines, text elements, the warp groups, vector graphics, etc., plus the effects, so the dynamic stuff, timers and int32 effects, etc., plus the event handlers for key press handlers or the touch handlers. With those, you can now create your own and dedicated UI control or widget, for example. So first of all, let's tidy up a little bit and remove all those elements that are not needed right now. So make this empty again. With a widget, I mean something like a button. However, inside Embedded Wizard, it is not required that you would now implement your own button. Of course you can do, but you can also use a ready-to-use button. And therefore, that you see inside this widget gallery here, we have dedicated ready-to-use buttons, like this button there, like some toggle button, a radio button, sliders, another slider, a rotary knob, some gauges, value display, horizontal bars, vertical bars, some scroll bars, etc. All those can also be adapted somehow, for example, to fit the proper line, or make this button here bigger, etc. And yeah, those can also be used instantly. So by pressing again now the play button on the prototyper, then you can click, for example, on that button and change that according to your needs. And in this style, for example, all the light gray or the light gray or the dark gray elements, those can be touched and activated. As you see, for example, that gauge here is just a element that is used to display the current value, and you cannot use it. However, you can use that, for example, or this element there. Of course, those widgets do not fulfill your design requirements. How to change that? In fact, what all those have in common is that all the widgets are assigned with a proper appearance. And appearance is something that you also find in other environments, for example in web programming, where you have HTML5 and CSS3, for example, which defines the structure and the look. And this is something, this concept, you can also find inside those widgets here. The button defines the behavior, so when pressing the play button, what should happen when you press that button, or what happens when you toggle this button, and what happens if you slide that button there. And this one is defined inside the implementation of that widget. So for example, double clicking on that opens the implementation, as you know, and then you see different kind of properties, you see different kind of events, and everything is implemented. Different state management is implemented. Different asset key events are recognized, touch events are recognized, etc. And this is a ready to use button, full featured push button, for example. So going just back into the application, and this behavior is independent from the given appearance, how it should look like. And in fact, this one is now used with the default one, and for example, you can also now select other appearances. So for example, the large one, as you see, the caption text gets bigger, also the border gets bigger, or let's pick this one, and you see that also immediately that it changes, so it gets bigger in order to adapt your screen resolution, for example, a little bit. Or let's pick the small one, which is a little bit smaller. However, this style, so the green color and the elements, those usually do not fit with your design requirements, and therefore you would need to add a new appearance. And just remember a couple minutes before, when we had the warp group, or when we had the attributed text, or when we had different kind of font text views where you need to add different font resources, for example, in that same manner, or for the vectors, in the same manner, you have also now different kind of configurations for all those various widget elements, widget sets. And for example, let's just take this push button configuration here, and you can now configure it according to your requirements. So this one is a very simple configuration. Of course, when looking at, for example, the rotary knob configuration, has much more properties which can be defined. Just scrolling down a little bit. As the same before, I do not want to dive now into every property and every aspect of this different kind of configuration, just to show you this push button configuration as an example. And for example, here I say for this face active, so which is the bitmap to be used. in case I'm now pressing this push button here, and what I'm now doing is pick the, for example, this symbol icons in medium style for all different kind of states. So we have an active state, we have a default state, we have a disabled state, and we have a focus state. However, you should now also define how these images and which items should be used. And honestly speaking, I do not know them very well, so I'm just now picking 0, 1, 2, 3, for example. Very simple one. Now I have configured that according to my specification. Of course, you can add your own bitmaps and your own colors and everything which comes from the design specification, and configure that. And as you see, it's also an object, so that means you can put a dedicated object into the dedicated core group class, like here in the application class, or you can, for example, also make an auto object out of that configuration and assign it from a global perspective to all different kind of push buttons that you have used all over your GUI project. And if you want them to change the appearance, from one color to the other, or another image or whatsoever, another font, then you only have to adapt this appearance at one place, when you have used it in a global manner, as just mentioned. So now for this caption here, for the push button here, I can now pick another appearance, and that way it's the push button configuration. Now you see that it looks a little bit different, and something that I have forgotten to do is the layout, which just also uses the resize horizontal and vertical aspect, and in that way it's zoomed and made some kind of wallpaper, which I do not want to have. I only want to have this only icon here. Pressing now the play button starts a prototyper, and when I now press that button, then you see that it changes depending on my state. So very easy one, and this can now be done for all the different kind of widgets. However, that widget itself is ready to use. It is full featured, it is tested, but it could be that you have a very special requirement. Just think about this horizontal slider there. This one is working in a very linear way, very easy. Just think about, you need this horizontal slider reacting on a logarithmic function or exponential function, depending on your requirements, I don't know, or different steps, for example. Then you would need to adapt that. However, what we learned before, do not do any modification inside the Mosaic framework. You could do, of course, a derivement of that dedicated widget. Just derive from this widget set horizontal slider, make your adaptations, and you're happy. One possibility. However, what we are also deploying are the so-called templates, which can be found inside the component templates folder inside the gallery. And for that, then you see that there's also a push button. And this push button is now a class, so it's not an object like what we have here inside the widget, which can be drag and dropped easily. These templates are classes, and remember, you cannot drag and drop a class now into another object or another class. In that way, you need to go to the unit and drag and drop that new element, just removing that new element, that new class now inside your application. Double clicking on that opens implementation, and what you see now is a very basic push button with already reacts on different kind of touch events, which already reacts on different kind of key events. It already reacts depending on different kind of UI states, so if it is enabled, if it is selected, etc. And it also has some very small timer that lets, when we now just, sorry, wrong button, the left one, so start prototyper with this class, which lets let the red rectangle appear and disappear depending on the current state. Therefore, this timer is used. And all different kind of templates are available. Push button, toggle button, the same one that we already saw before inside the ready to use widget sets, but they are also well documented what are required to do in order to adjust that template according to your needs. And just pick this one. Let's say, okay, we have our background, and that background goes update view state. I think it's there. Should go to different kind of colors. And in fact, so if it is not enabled, if it is pressed, here it is, the background color should change now to red, what we already saw. As I'm pressing the play button, I press here the button, and the rectangle sitting in the background goes to red. According to my design, I would like to have this going to blue. So that means red, green, and blue. So there's just these two zeros missing, and the F is too much. Here we go. So, and that means, so every time I'm now pressing that button, it goes to some not so blue one, dark blue, because there's the F missing. This happens during live coding, sorry for that. So pressing again, which goes now to blue. And there you have now the possibility to adapt that according to your needs without using the ready-to-use widget sets. So it's always a trade-off. Are you happy with the given widget sets, and does it already react in such a way that you would like to use? Then it's very easy. You can start your prototypes very easy, and just use the widgets, assign new appearances to the widgets, and that's it. If you would like to implement your own widgets, depending on your requirements, then simply assign and implement different templates. However, this template should now be used inside my own application, and therefore just remember on one of our previous masterclasses, switching now the view to the browser, search for my new push button inside my application, drag and drop that into this canvas, and we can now use it accordingly as it was previously implemented. And of course, with the object-oriented approach, you can closing that. You can also make multiple instances of different push buttons here. So this one is for the templates, for example. So for the templates, and you see there's everything, push button, toggle button, already ready to use. However, it could be that there's some kind of element which is not available because it's a custom UI control. Therefore, we are also providing the so-called component template. And the component template, so the same one as before, you cannot drag that into the class. You can only drag that into the unit, and what you see, there's just one thing. It is already derived from core group, what we did before with our 2.5D text element, where we did this perspective transformation, and it's documented. So what to do, just change the size, change the bounds, and there are now two functions overwritten, and these one are also essential when it comes to take care about different layouting mechanism, when it comes to take care about different state handling. And therefore there's so-called update view state, and it already is very well documented. What are the different states it's enabled or selected or focused or modal, etc., and what should be done in order to react on different kind of states according to your implementation. And the update layout in the same manner would then enable you, okay, when different layouting mechanisms are used. What I would not mention now in this masterclass right now is for example, when you set automatical layouting to the left side or to the right side, etc., then this is something that can also be taken into account and adapted according to your needs. And that's it. So in fact, it's just a core group with already overwritten update view state and already overwritten update layout methods, which can be adapted as described here. And of course, inside our knowledge base or on the online knowledge base, you find much more information what these all aspects are for, and how to adapt that according to your needs. Okay, so just to recap, we have in fact different ready-to-use widgets with different possibilities to assign different appearances. Standard one, default one. If you want to add your own implementation, then just go ahead and use these kind of component templates, which are already pre-implemented, I would say, with the most common one, for example, React on state handling, etc. And if none of them fits your requirement, you can just create your own application, your own component, and implement and design your own UI control according to your needs. If you now want to put your own implemented UI controls, so elements, into a so-called scrollable container or scrollable content, for example a list or other aspects, therefore the Mosaic framework also provides dedicated views and elements that can be used. So just going back now to the views element, and then you see that there are two different kind of scrollable content elements that are available. First of all, we have the classical list, which is vertical list and horizontal list, and we have the so-called outline box. So let's, for example, go ahead and let's have a look at the vertical list. Therefore, just tidy up a little bit, remove the elements that are not needed right now, so removing them, and simply drag and drop this vertical list now as an example into this canvas here. And what you see, what does now come with the vertical list? In fact, we have two items. First of all is the list itself, and we have a dedicated slot method, the onload item method. Just remove that from the canvas. And what I'm now doing is just create let's use the list for the entire screen. So that means everything is now inside. Selecting the vertical list, and let's have a look at the different kind of attributes that we are using right now. First of all, something which is important to know or important to set is the so-called item class. Which item should be used in order to should be used inside that list for one item. And per default it goes to views text. Of course, you could also say views rectangle, but in that way the onload item will not work because it assumes that there's an views text there. So let's stick on the views text element right now. So just changing that back again to views text, and you can define your class. In fact, you should now also do and define your own class. Perhaps let's do that. For example, let's go to the unit. We define a new component which is empty because it's my new one, and I say, okay, this is my list item, and double clicking on that. This is something I do not need. We do not do any special state handling and layout mechanism. However, I just want to say, okay, this one is in that way and has this properties, which let's pick these 40 pixels because the usual one is 640 and 60 pixels of height, and just reload the item. So this one should be one item in size. Then I'm just saying, okay, I'd like to have a very simple line, which is my separator, for example, and use that and add now some text element, make this a little bit more bigger, something like that. Assign a new font, medium font, and say for the alignment it should not be centered, it should go horizontal on the left side, and we do not have the white color, we have some black color so that you see that. And in addition to that, we have some image, and this one goes to our symbol items that we already have with the frame number 0, for example, heart. So let's pick this one. I don't know, doesn't matter. So changing, for example, also the color there, make this black, and then you see that. So a very simple one. Just two elements, text element, image element, and the separator with the proper bounds, and 640 by 60. So going now back to the application. Then I say for the list, okay, I'm not now using this views text class, I'm now using my new application list item. Okay, and then you see it already adds dedicated items to this list. However, we do not have 24 pixels. In fact, we had, I think it was 60 pixels in total, and this one takes that into account as well. Number of items, this is also something that can be changed during runtime. So just remove that. So it's just it can be changed during runtime. And as of now, we can also say, okay, let's take 50 items. Finally, you need to assign the list which onload item slot method should be used in order to take care about the loading of each element. The onload item, and just double click on that, let's have a look on what is done there. First of all, when this one gets triggered by the list, it says, okay, for which current item should I now take being responsible to put the proper text in there. Then it says for the item number, vertical list item, then I have the proper item number, and finally I have my view, but now I don't have a view's text, now I have a application list item as my view. And this is now casted, but I need the proper variable for my proper class, so in that way it's not view's text, it's list item view. If my item view is null, then return, okay, just to be safe. And now this one would be the part where the proper configuration should be taken into account. Because I set the proper bounds of 60 pixels in width and with 60 pixels in height and 640 pixels in width, I do not do any automatic size correction and correcting of this bounds of this item view. However, what I'm now really looking forward is to change now the configuration of my item according to my list. Unfortunately, this is something that will not work right now because we do not have a string and a font, etc. We need first of all to define a proper interface for my item class. So what I'm now doing, just reloading that, and so ensure that the list will work. So going now back to my list item, I will now add an interface so that it can now be changed from an outside object like my list view, for example. And therefore, just remember we had the last time different properties, and what I'm now doing is say, okay, this is my my caption which should be of type string. Then we have another item which is my icon number integer 32. That's fine. So these are now the new properties that I can use now inside another view. However, I need to override the onset caption in order to take this new value into account. And for that, I'm just saying, okay, my text element, which has a dedicated string, this should now be assigned with the new value. If you're not so sure why there is pure and why there is value, please have a look at the previous webinar where we talked about the concepts of the properties, and there I explained what these elements are all about. And the same one for the icon. For the icon number, I can then say, okay, for my dedicated image view, image dot frame number equals my value. So very simple one. Now, of course, you could now add your new elements, etc. For example. So this one goes usually to 0. So we just pressing now Ctrl R on my keyboard, which goes to the default frame number, and the caption is empty. And what I can now do is now going back into our application where the list is and say, okay, every time I'm now loading this item, I can now define my item view. And when you now open the when you type in the dot, then the assistant comes up and you see that there's a new property appearing up. So this one, which is the caption, and the caption says this is my item number plus any string that I get during runtime from item number, so which has been received while it is being invoked from the the list element itself, and we have the item view icon number equals to my item number, and I think there are a maximum of 10 elements built inside, so just modulo 10. So in order to have some wrap up, so prototyping that again, then you see log window. I missed some semicolon. Where is it? Item number, something like that, plus the string, of course. So pressing on the play button, and then you see now I have different items, and depending on the different item number, I'm now using different frame numbers of that framed images where I have multiple items now inside. So very easy. However, we talked about scrollable content. So what should now be added in order to have this kind of scrollable content? Of course, we need an event handler, and as you can imagine, we have a slide touch handler which should be added on top of this application, and in fact it should cover the entire screen. And that slide touch handler itself is very, very easy to set. So just something that should be kept into mind is that we are only allowed to slide vertically, because it's a vertical list and not horizontal, and therefore I'm just disabling that. Another very important thing is when should I snap my images, my items. For example, before addressing that parameter here, which is also something that is modified very often, let's go back to the list and assign now our new added slide touch handler with that list. And therefore you see while selecting this vertical list that there's a property called slide handler, and that slide handler is now assigned with a slide touch handler. And by now starting the element there, then you see that you can now very easy slide this list, for example. However, what I mentioned before, you see that this item here is now not snapping to the next item. We have the separator, and usually I would expect that the entire list item is being displayed to this list there. And therefore, I'm just selecting now back again. No better copy, sorry. Selecting this slide touch handler here, and for that I'm saying now please snap in with every next element with an X and an Y value. X should be 0 because we are now sliding in not horizontally, we are sliding vertically, but you should slide every 60 pixels with our when we are sliding. So what's now happening, you see you can now not, when I now slide for example to the middle of this item number 1, and when I'm now releasing my mouse button, then you see that it snaps depending on where we are, how it goes to the next one, and this one gives you a much better feeling when it comes to add this kind of slide touch handler. So this is one for the list. The same would be for this vertical list. The same would be for horizontal list. However, another scrollable content which is also used quite often is a so-called outline box. An outline box is something like a container, a scrollable container that can be used to group different kind of views into an embedded view. So how does this work? So let's, for example, remove that slide touch handler, remove this vertical list item, and the onload is not necessary right now. We are just now adding this outline box. Outline box, for example, let's go into that direction, and this should now add different images, for example. So, and make these scrollable. So we have one image. Let's, for example, let's take an image there. Use now our icon set that we used before. Now take the large one or the extra large one. So for example like that. So there's one item, and then we have multiple different items. And just now make a copy and paste and just assign them very, very randomly. So let's assume these are the different items that should be now scrolled inside this list in a proper way. So for example, to make them a little bit more easy to identify, perhaps another one, so 10 elements is there. Let's assign different kind of frame numbers just to see them. So this is the frame number 10. This one would be 9. This one goes to 8, to 7, to 6, to 5, to 4, 5, 4, to 3, to 2, and finally to 0. It could be to 1. I don't know. So now we have these different items. Now I need this outline in order to let those different view images being arranged automatically. Yeah? And therefore I just say, okay, for all these image items, those by selecting everyone, those should be embedded. And this is one of the parameter which defines that these are now belonging to this underlying outline here. However, as you see, when I'm now just pressing on the play button, you see nothing. Now these belong to the outline, but we did not had set any formation. And what I like to add is, for example, from left to right. So to make them aligned from left to right. And when I'm now pressing on the play button, then you see that this outline takes care about aligning these elements automatically according to my formation left to right. However, we are speaking about scrollable content, and in order to make these things scrollable, not effects, I need the event handlers. I'd also like now to add a dedicated event handler on top of my outline view, and in the same way I say, okay, this one should now slide only in a horizontal way, so not vertically right now. It should what size do we have? We have here the bounds width of, just have a look, 105 pixels. So the snap next goes to now the X value, not the Y value, to 105 pixels. And finally we need to assign now this new slide touch handler to my given outline, and therefore I'm just setting this property slide handler with the slide touch handler. So now pressing again the play button, and what you now have is a scrollable content for these elements that I drag and dropped before. This is another approach on how to create scrollable content. Of course, with different formation, you could now also do a scrolling not in this horizontal way. It could also be in a vertical way, or you could also do some other stuff depending on the formation, and this gives you much more flexibility in terms of achieve some scrollable content at the end. Next to scrolling elements, sometimes it's also essential to make some screen transitions. Just think about, you have different kind of screen elements and you want to switch from one screen to the other. This question was raised quite often, so I think it's now worth to explain how this can be achieved. First of all, I'd like to close all composers windows and just going back into my application. As same before, just remove them, tidy up so we have a new one. Now I'd like to add a new widget, which is my simple button here, which gives me one opportunity and then the second one. Don't get irritated by different views. This one is now focused because it's the first element and hence it is gray, but this is not now the essential one. However, I just want to say, okay, when I press that button, which should be my first screen, then it should show the first screen, whereas this one show second screen instead. So two buttons, and those two buttons, by pressing them, just testing that, you can press that, perfect. They should now take care about screen transitions. But before doing any screen transitions, I would need to implement proper screens, and therefore, same before, just drag and drop a component there, and I say this one is my screen 1, and a new component which is my screen number 2. So, and that one, same before, I do not take care about updating the view states, etc. But it should go to the entire width of that screen with, let's say, I don't know, 400 pixels in height. And here we go. So let's make this a little bit more fancier. So let's put there an image there, just removing that, add a new rectangle there, and say this one is a not white. Let's pick some gray element, full opaque. So, and a new text there, which should be on the entire width, and it should go to another font. I think you're already familiar with that technique, and we say this one is my screen number 1, and the other one, going back to the application, I do not want to do the things twice, so just remove that and now simply make a copy, which is my screen 2, open the implementation and say, okay, this one is screen number 2. And this one would now depend depends on your dedicated requirements. If you have different screens with different content, then you would adapt that according to your needs, of course. But this is just an example. We have 2 screens, so let's, for example, make also the background a little bit more easier to identify, to distinguish. Now we have some greenish color. So screen number 2 is this green background with screen number 2 as this text element, and the other one, screen number 1, is gray background with the text element, screen number 1. So very, very easy one. So what do we now do inside our application? So when I just press now the first screen, I'd like to do something, and when I press the second screen button, I'd like to do another thing. And therefore, I'm now adding a dedicated slot method, and this one would simply be show screen 1, or let's make it a little bit more sophisticated, show screen. And both elements, which is my push button 1, push button 1 and the original push button, and I'm just renaming them, which says button screen 1, and the other one is button screen 2. And both of them, so just selecting both of them should now go and hit and emit a signal when both of them are activated. Okay, so both are activated, both trigger a signal on this show screen element. So double clicking on that opens the implementation inside the editor, and what I'm now doing is just to see, okay, have I done everything right? Did I make the connection with the on activated in the proper way? Starting again and switching to the debug window, clear the lock, and when I'm now pressing, then I say, okay, this comes from my button screen 1 and this one comes from my button screen 2. So this one works as expected. Perfect. So dialog framework. In fact, we have now multiple possibilities in order to create a view. So first of all, something which is essential, let's just do it very simple. I'd like to create a new variable which is application of type application screen 1, and this goes to my screen 1, and then I'm creating it newly with a new statement application screen 1. And I think it's sufficient not to have a screen 1. I think it's views group, and not views group, sorry, core group. This happens during live coding. I'm very sorry for that. So please excuse my typing. Core group. So yeah, here we go. Okay, so this one is core group, screen 1. Just make a new instance out of that, and then I say, okay, let's simply add that current screen to my currently opened component, which is my root application, my application class in that way. So therefore I just say okay, screen 1, and Z ordering, I need to tell them the proper Z ordering. In fact, when I hit 0, then it adds on the topmost position. When I now press again the play button, and when I'm pressing now here this button there, just initiates my new screen here and adds it to the view. However, when I'm now pressing again the button there, then you will not see it, but in fact I would now have added 4 or 5 objects into the current view. Of course, this is something that we need to avoid. Therefore, I would now need to add a variable to my view. I would need to store my currently added new instance of my application screen 1, and every time I'm now pressing again the button, then I would remove that, etc. This is not so nice. Therefore, we have added the so-called dialog framework inside Embedded Wizard. With the dialog framework, you have in fact an API, so it's done for in a dynamic way, where you can add screens depending on the requirement. For example, if you want to have multiple screens sitting on top, then you would say, let's present a dialog. However, if you want to switch from one screen to another, then you would use the so-called switch to dialog API. And this is now something that we are now going to implement. So this one is absolutely right, but we do not use that. We say, okay, or first of all, let's make the proper distinguishing from whom we are. So if the sender equals my button screen 1, then I'm going to create a new screen, but let's make it this one and make this put to a global aspect, and then I say okay, screen equals new application screen 1. Otherwise, we are from the other sender, so we just say okay, my screen equals to a new application screen 2, for example. So now I'm using the dialog framework, and I said there are two APIs. The first one would be the present dialog, or the other one, and this would now add further dialogs, and what we are now using is just switch to dialog, and this is the API we are using. And when you look at the API, it's quite sophisticated and not so easy. Let's perhaps just give a rough overview how this should work. Switch to dialog would mean, first of all, the first parameter is which element should be added. In that way, let's add our new created screen depending who the sender is. Button 1 initiates a screen 1, and button 2 initiates screen 2 item. Then we can add dedicated transitions. Transitions mean should they fade in, should they move, something like that. And these transitions can be used from the resources, and this is something that you see right now. Where are they? Sorry, not resources, effects. And you see that you have shown high dialog transition, fade in and out dialog transition, slide dialog transition, and scale dialog. So these are the predefined transitions that can be used very easily. However, I do not want any transition because that makes it more complex, and in that way I just say okay, it's null, so no transitions should be used in terms of when I'm adding a screen, or when I'm removing a screen again, then there can other screens be used for this dialog. And we have then restoring when one comes back again, etc. So you see there are really quite tons of different transitions that can be added to this API call, and I'm just now saying null for everyone. However, you can also now define different slot methods. For example, when the transition is completed, or if it is cancelled. So for example, inside the transition you can also cancel that current transition, and that's not necessary right now. So we have here null, and here we have null again, and I combine with that. You can combine multiple switches into one action and to one transition. So if you have 3, 4, 5 screens that should be made visible once at the same time, then you could combine those different into one action. But as of now, we do not want to combine because we only have one screen, hence I say false. So what's happening when I'm pressing again the play button, and then you see by pressing the play button 1 just opens now the screen, and you see it's positioned now to the center. Therefore I'm just now make this a little bit smaller here. I'm pressing at the play button, so opens now my first screen, and when I'm now pressing the second screen, it simply switches now to the other screen, or back and forth and back and forth. So this is now a very easy one. However, you would now adapt the proper display resolutions and put the proper bounds now to the screen. So this is something which is of course essential, and yeah, so this is something that you could now add. However, something important to know, the switch to dialog is something where you would just switch from one screen to another. So also your memory is then tidied up later on by the garbage collector, because when switching to, you will not have any further reference to the previously used screen. But if you want to have some kind of Z ordering or some kind of stack available, just think about a menu, where you have a menu and the menu item goes to a sub-menu, and inside that sub-menu you have another item, and that item goes to a sub-sub-menu, then you would have some kind of Z ordering. And that Z ordering can be kept when not using the switch to dialog. This can be kept when using the so-called present dialog API. Yeah, just some side note. However, this is now the functionality on how to add different screens just per button. Of course, you can now modify this and put different buttons now into this screen, and then do the transition inside one screen, so you can nest different groups inside one. This is of course also possible. However, just a side note as well, please have a look at our knowledge base, and then you see one entry which says manage screen transitions using the dialog framework. Just please have a look at it, read it carefully, and then you pretty much know how to do this and how to tweak that according to your requirements. Yeah, so this was quite a lot of stuff right now. I hope you're still aware, and I hope that there are now some questions. So Christine, please feel free, and are there any questions that have been asked in the meantime?
Welcome back from my side. Now we're coming to the Q&A session, and there are already some questions popping in. I pick out the first one right away. Does Embedded Wizard support multi-touch events, Manuel?
Okay, so I think the multi-touch is something that I already explained before. Perhaps something also to see how this is implemented inside the prototyper. Therefore, just going now to screen 1, adding some new slider, this one and that one. So make these a little more bigger, for example, and start the prototyper. And what you now have with the mouse, for example, when you now click on that with the left mouse button, then you can drag and drop. Multi-touch asset is already implemented, and therefore this is now something which is essential when you have multi-touch applications, how to use that within the prototyper. First of all, I'm now pressing and holding the Alt key on my keyboard. And now I can place on the screen where my fingers are. For that one, this should be the first finger, and that should be my second finger. I'm still pressing now the Alt key, and now I'm releasing that, and now I have set the elements. And what you see now is now two fingers inside the prototyper that I can use now for pressing, and now you can see I can use them simultaneously with two fingers, for example. If you would have some classical pinch and zoom gesture, then you can also do that, for example, and this is achieved by holding now the Shift key while pressing. And what you now see is to make this kind of zooming, and of course it's not implemented, but as you can see, we are now rotating the fingers accordingly, and releasing the shift key enables me now to do some different other mouse gestures now only with the mouse. You can get rid of these multi-touch fingers by just pressing again the Alt key again, then it's gone and you're back to normal and you can use it. I hope that this fulfills the question.
Another question I want to pick out from the audience is, which bitmap format should I use for my GUI projects? Which bitmap format should I use for my GUI projects?
This is not an easy answer to give for that question. In fact, Embedded Wizard can cope with different kind of bitmap formats. When just going back to the application and add a new bitmap resource, for example, then you have different kind of formats to be used. There's the so-called native format, it's RGB 565, Index 8, and Alpha 8. The Alpha 8 bitmap, I think it is something I already mentioned before, is an image format that only contains alpha values, and these can be used to colorize them during runtime in a very easy way. Just think about, you have an icon, and that icon is goes for a warning or goes for an arrow, or like this info icon here, for example, that you see on the left side, and you would only have this defined as an Alpha 8 bitmap, and you can use that now during runtime to make this yellow, to make this red, orange, whatsoever. And so you do not need to store 3, 4, 5 more or less same looking images inside your project. You can only use this alpha image here and let Embedded Wizard colorize them during runtime, which saves a lot. Alpha 8 bitmaps, by the way, are stored with 8 bit per pixel, so it's very, very easy. And as the name implies, it already comes with an alpha value, because only the alpha values are indicating how strong a dedicated color should be renderized. Index 8, this is also a very nice format when it comes to save a lot of bitmap resources in terms of flash memory and RAM memory, SRAM memory, for example, or SDRAM, depending on how you configure your system. Index 8 is a palette-based, something that you know from the GIF format. This is in use, and we are storing per bitmap resource individual color lookup tables, so individual palettes that are used during runtime when those bitmap images should be made visible. Those index 8, as the name implies, is a palette with a dedicated index. Those refer to a color, and that color itself is then an RGBA 8888 bitmap format and color format, and that implies that you can also do alpha blending with this palette based image format. And index 8 means index 8, so 8-bit, so 256 entries in that color lookup table. That means that the image itself is also very reduced in terms of flash consumption. So you would then also need 8-bit per pixel or 1 byte per pixel in order to store that. The native color format, this is a format which depends on the frame buffer format. For example, if you have an RGBA 8888 frame buffer format, then bitmaps are stored in that way as your profile is, if there is an alpha value, of course, available. RGB 565, this is something where you can explicitly say, okay, this, for example, is a background image, there is no alpha channel inside, and then you can store that as a pure RGB 565 bitmap format, which also gives a very high quality depending on the use case, of course. So these are the the most common formats. So it's a little bit hard to distinguish because everyone has a dedicated use case or relies dedicated use case. Index 8, for example, if you want to play back video files, which comes with a lot of frames, and then it makes really sense to store them in a compressed way with Index 8, which is really nice looking video at the end, but that does not need to require a lot of flash size, for example. Whereas others, if you want to have sophisticated bitmap, then go to native or Alpha 8 when it comes to colorizing, etc. And this is something that can be used for your GUI project.
Thank you, Manuel. It seems like it's already a kind of tradition. I also this time have to pick out a third but last question. So I will pick out a last one, but as usually, please be assured that if you have further questions, feel free to drop us these in, and those that already were handed in will be answered via email one-to-one later. So my last question is, how can I overlay different touch handlers, Manuel?
Yeah, how can I overlay different touch handlers? Going back now to screen one. Just remember, we had here different event handlers. So, for example, a simple touch handler, and let's, for example, take also a slide touch handler. And Embedded Wizard is structured in such a way that depending on the Z ordering, only in that way, now the slide touch handler would get all different all touch events. However, it's only configured in such a way that it, per default, only reacts on slide gestures or detects those. If I simply press them, then it will not be recognized. However, there's a parameter built inside each event handler, which is the so-called retarget condition. And the retarget condition says, okay, when should I simply use or should I not take care about different or when I should not take care about another gesture. For example, for a long press, for example, then this long press does not belong now to the slide touch handler. It is then being deflected to the underlying touch handler, for example, that simple touch handler. And with that, you can overlay multiple different touch handlers, and with the retarget condition, and you can fine tune that with delay and some offsets when it comes to swiping, for example. Then this is some very nice feature to have multiple different kind of gesture recognitions in terms of these event handlers, and depending on the retarget conditions you set, you can really fine-tune that which slide handler is then responsible to react on different slide gestures. As said today multiple times, please have a look at the knowledge base. There you find the demos and examples and proper documentation how this retarget functionality is used. So now I think it's time to close this session. I hope I was not too fast, and I hope the content was interesting for you. So thank you very much for attending. It's really a pleasure to have you here, and also I'd like to thank you very much also for your feedback that you're giving after these webinars took place. So thank you very much. Now it's my turn to say goodbye. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope to see you and see you soon at next Masterclass Monday. Next Monday, same time, same channel, and take care, stay healthy. Bye bye.
We are now coming to the end of this fourth episode. If you liked it, feel free to recommend to others, to your colleagues, or whoever is interested in embedded UI development. We would appreciate if we spread the word all together about this webinar series. Excuse me. And we would be happy if we could welcome even more attendees next time. So, next time, this brings me to my last but not least point. The poll question will be opening up after this webinar closes. So, the poll question concerns, again, already as you are already used to it, the topic that we'll be covering next time. So, thank you very much for your attendance and hope to hear you next time or see you virtually next time again. Bye bye.